Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this special edition of the Predator Watch podcast. There's a subject that we must deal with because it is progressing and ultimately it is putting women in harm's way. Over the past few years, a number of the states in the U.S. have followed a number of other Western European countries of placing men in women's prisons after such men claim to, identify as female, under the politically correct and woke justification that such men are at risk, being housed in male prisons, and they're safer being placed in women's facilities, women's prisons. So out of compassion, we need to house such deviant men there. Well, despite what we're being told by the mainstream media and those who would push such an untrue narrative, that this is a policy born from concern for at-risk, sensitive men who find themselves in male prisons because they are male. That's why they're in male prisons. What's the reality? Are these men in need of being placed in women's prisons? And what about the women who have no say in the matter, who are now being required to be housed with these men? Is it safe for them? Is it safe for these women? Or is their safety being compromised? Are they being placed in harm's way, as deviant men are placed in there with them, where the women become sitting ducks for these deviant men to prey upon them sexually? Is this movement about ensuring the safety of such deviant men? Well, the answer is a clear no.
Psychiatrist Dr. Tanveer Ahmed has written about this issue for The Spectator Australia, and he joins me in the studio. This would concern people, Tanveer, wouldn't it? But there's no easy solution, is there?
Look, it is a challenge, and it hasn't blown up yet locally, but it's become an issue internationally. Now, the key point here is trans women retain male patterns of criminality, and British statistics, they're 5 times more likely to commit an assault, including a sexual assault, than their female co-inmates, if you like.
In the general population or in the prison population?
In the prison population.
Yeah, but you're saying because they're male, because all the statistics say males are more likely to be criminal than
Being
females.
male is the single biggest predictor of crime, and sexual crimes even more so, more than 90%. Now, internationally, it's blowing up. So only last month, New Jersey had the same policy as New South Wales, Victoria, ACT, Tasmania, which was they housed according to their gender identity. They've just flipped it. There was a woman there, Demi Minor. Turned out she'd impregnated 3 women in the prison system.
We hear academics and politicians who defend such policies and laws that they pass. Well, these are safe and humane, but the dirty little secret is that few, if any, of those who are pushing such laws and policies, well, they've never really worked behind bars with or in the right kinds of positions in the prison system, or have ever worked closely with these kinds of men, the kinds they're approving to be transferred into women's prisons. They haven't worked with them clinically. The reality is that the push to place deviant men into women's prisons is based upon an agenda that's unfolding right before our eyes, with connections to the sexualization of kids by means of the trans deception, the push to allow men in women's sports, the push to legalize and decriminalize prostitution, and the push to legitimize or destigmatize pedophilia, as it ultimately is about the normalization of deviant men being able to access and cross the boundaries of vulnerable women and kids. It has nothing to do with inclusion. It has everything to do with sexually deviant men who've become that way through years' worth of watching progressive pornography. The downward path to deviance has always been the same, but ever since pornography and the internet, the entire process has been supercharged. And these are men who want direct access, direct hands-on access, ultimately to women and children in their private spaces. In this case, in the case of men in female prisons, it's all about accessing vulnerable women in their private spaces. Well, some are going to ask, well, who am I to speak to the issue? Well, that's a fair question. As I don't often share this half of my professional background with many people, as I tend to emphasize my professional counseling background in my work with survivors, with SurvivorSupport.net, and my weekly live program, Journey to Healing, which can be heard on tecntv.com, Friday nights, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for purposes of producing the Predator Watch podcast, I draw upon my 11-plus years of intensive clinical work on psychology staff within the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. I was recruited to create what would be the nation's first intensive treatment program to men in long-term solitary confinement. It was there that I accrued over the course of time, both in the long-term solitary program and then in general population solitary, more clinical contact hours in that environment than any other psychology staff member in the U.S. or Canada. I was trained by Dr. Robert Hare, who was flown out by the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections to provide specialized training to a small group of us toward forensic certification in the PCLR, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. I was then afforded the opportunity to oversee the clinical treatment in one of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections specialized forensic sex offender treatment units, a 65-bed program for high-risk and sexually violent predators and pedophiles. I also conducted high and low-intensity sex offender treatment groups within the general prison population. I've written hundreds of prison psych evals and reviewed and assessed the level of risk for hundreds of sex offenders, along with serving in other clinical capacities within the prison system, including drug and alcohol treatment and the institution's specialized unit for mental health inmates. Since my retirement from the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections back in 2016, I've run SurvivorSupport.net, and I have a full-time counseling practice, and I run multiple weekly sex offender treatment groups for men on parole. I'm both certified as a clinical trauma professional, having worked with survivors for many, many years, and I'm a certified sex offender treatment provider. Well, unlike my colleagues that still work in the prison system, I'm actually free to address this issue since I no longer work in the prison system. Many of my colleagues are upset by how women are being placed in harm's way by this kind of policy. So they're appreciative for my willingness to speak out about this misguided move to place men in women's prisons. As a professional with extensive experience working with the kinds of men who are requesting to be transferred into women's prisons, I want to state as clearly as I can that anyone who is pushing this, or anyone who facilitates this from a lawmaker's perspective, or from a prison administration's perspective, does so either out of a grave degree of ignorance, or out of complicity, or out of an agenda. It's as simple as that, and you know it. Some of you may have seen the following chart that I developed to help explain how men become sexually deviant, but I wanted to show it in this video to help the viewers understand the kind of men that are asking to be placed in women's prisons. Now, these are not sensitive men. These are not fearful men. These are very sophisticated manipulators who are sexually deviant and who are playing the public for fools. Those who are seeking to rebrand male sexual deviance, who want to make it appear as less dangerous than it actually is, are seeking to ensure that no one comes to understand that these men, the men that are asking to be transferred into women's prisons, are actually porn-saturated men, who are more than just men with a fetish, but are men who've progressed through the stages of deviance and developed a malevolence toward women, and many have developed a desire to defile kids, which is why many of them were busted with child porn. That does not make them any less dangerous, but in fact more, as they inevitably consumed deviant adult porn as well, and the kind that perpetrates violence, serious violence against women. That is what conducting years' worth of sex offender treatment in the proper way and having access to police files in prison, that's what it revealed very clearly. If you'd like to see some of my clinical work from behind bars, I would invite you to go to churchprotect.org, then under the Truths tab, the truths about predators. Because of the importance of this issue in terms of the need to protect vulnerable women in prison from deviant predatory men, I elected to do this special interview, which brings together the experience of two seasoned professionals, myself and Mr. Ken Herdman, who was a treatment specialist within the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. We both combined have decades of experience working with exactly the kinds of men being transferred into women's prisons. Thus, our words carry professional and clinical weight and surpass those who are passing the laws or these policies that are facilitating men being placed in with women. The women who are then being subjected to predation of these deviant men. How confident can you be that the information revealed in this video is authoritative, reliable, and valid? I have a standing challenge to anyone in a lawmaking or policy-making capacity in any state, any province, or any federal prison system around the world to prove me wrong when I say that the men that are being transferred into women's prisons are a threat to female inmates. If you doubt that, or if you want to challenge me, then make the opportunity available for me at your expense to do an in-depth review and analysis of the process involved in the selection and screening of such men that you're sending into female prisons, and make available for me unfettered computer access to all of their prison files and their complete criminal histories, including police reports, charges, and plea deals. And I will show you how you are compromising the health, safety, and welfare of the women who are being subjected to the deviant men you're sending into their prisons. My challenge to all good citizens, regardless of political persuasion or party, my challenge to churches and synagogues and mosques and other people of faith, and to the same women's groups who have been able to assemble mass marches in Washington, D.C., my challenge is to no longer remain silent on this issue. It is time to do something, and do something in a significant way to stop this predation against women who are now being subjected to this. This is not about protecting sensitive men in prison, and it's not about being transphobic, which is the ultimate smokescreen thrown up by pushers and promoters of sexual deviant men who intend to ensure that deviant men can access the private spaces of women and children, which is also why they're pushing for men to be on women's sports teams and being able to sexualize kids by means of SOGI sex ed, sexual orientation, and gender identity sex ed. My answer to the transphobia accusation? Well, it's simple. It is they who are phobic, not us. Not us who seek to raise the bar on the protection of women and children. It is they who are phobic. They are veritas phobic. They fear truth. They fear sunshine. And that's why they won't take me up on this offer to go in and look at all the files. Because those of you, the lawmakers and policy pushers, you know what a ruse this is. And you are harming women in the process. A middle ground has been proposed to open up a state facility for such deviant men. That's not a bad option. Apparently, there's 2 prison facilities right now slated for closing in California, which could be used to house such men. In fact, other male inmates from other states could also be sent to the California facilities, just like the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections did when it had overflow inmates who were sent to Michigan during the time I was employed in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. These inmates were sent to Michigan for a number of months. The reason why such a proposal will not gain any traction by the same kinds of politicians and prison administrators who are putting men in women's prisons is because this isn't about the safety of these men to begin with, but about allowing deviant men to have access to vulnerable women. That is what this is all about. Doubt that? Watch how many requests for transfers are withdrawn by these deviant men if they know that they're only going to be sent to a prison with other such deviant men. The requests would quickly drop off to almost zero. Why? Because it would no longer be of any interest to such deviant men, because their goal is to access vulnerable women. With that as background, we join our interview in progress.
Predator Watch finds a brief overview of important stories in the news or issues of concern as they relate to understanding the nature of sexual predators, their characteristics, how their minds operate, their methods of manipulation, and what motivates them. They hide in plain sight, can smell an opportunity a mile away, and count on people not understanding just how dark their hearts are and how intent they are about always producing victims. Stay tuned as John Euler, a licensed professional counselor with over 25 years of professional experience treating both survivors and sexual predators, shares his insights on this edition of Predator Watch.
I am John Euler, and this is the Predator Watch podcast. It is my distinct privilege to introduce you to not only a professional, but a colleague and a friend, Mr. Ken Herdman. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, John.
Well, Ken, we're going to be dealing with a topic that has brought about a lot of controversy, so a very controversial subject that I happen to deal with a lot in my kind of the other half of my life as far as my advocacy. And the issue of men in women's spaces has come up as far as their private spaces, and within that also we have the issue of men being transferred into women's prisons, and that's a very real issue now. It's generated a lot of interest, a lot of concern online, so I thought, who better to deal with the subject than two men that spent a lot of time in prison, but in a professional capacity in their own right. And so I thought to myself, who would make for a very, not only a good guest, but someone who is a wealth of information, than someone who spent years within the prison system in a number of capacities. And so between you and I want to say we probably have 40 years or more combined in dealing with men that are justice involved. So I'm going to ask you to give us a brief thumbnail sketch of your background, your professional background, because you just didn't start in corrections. You actually started in probation and parole.
Actually, I started in county mental health. I got my bachelor's in criminology. My first job out of college was with county mental health. I worked for crisis intervention department. I was one of the few people in the county who was empowered to commit people involuntarily to a psychiatric unit.
So you also have a mental health background, in a way, working in that capacity as far as involuntary commitments.
Correct. My wife worked for county mental health for quite a few years, much longer than I did, in a day treatment program. And when I left the county, I went to county probation. I worked there for 7.5 years. My wife and I had some clients in common. I had some people on supervision who also were part of the day treatment program. After 7.5 years with county probation, where I dealt with all manner of perpetrators, I interviewed both the perpetrators and victims for pre-sentence investigations, spent some time in the county jails. I actually traveled to several of the state prisons to interview perpetrators who had committed a new crime while on state parole. I got hired by the Department of Corrections, State Department of Corrections. I worked as a counselor for 24 years. 15 years on the housing unit, and when I could no longer handle that. I transferred to the treatment unit.
Now, Ken, if you could you differentiate, because you've just referenced counselor and then treatment unit, could you differentiate for those that are unfamiliar with a prison setting? Now, some of these terms may be unique to Pennsylvania, but there's probably overlap or similarities across different state systems. But differentiate for us between, as you referenced, you worked as a prison counselor and then in the treatment capacity.
Certainly. As a housing unit counselor, we handled a lot of paperwork and we handled the day-to-day needs of the inmates. Our office was right on the housing unit, in the back of the housing unit. So in order to get to our office, we had to walk through the pod where we had 64 cells. And of those 64 cells, probably 60 of them were double celled.
And for people that don't know, prison now uses a lot of euphemistic terms. So a housing unit is the old-fashioned, there's an old-fashioned term, it used to be called a cell block.
Correct. And that's what they were called in the old institutions. The newer institutions where I worked and you worked, at least in the your last job in the DOC, walk onto the housing unit and you walk into a lobby area. There is a locking door to the outside that you would walk into. In the lobby, to the left is one housing unit, to the right is another housing unit. They both have also locking doors so that they can be secured in the event of an emergency, and also they're secured at night. You have over 120 inmates with one housing unit officer, one counselor who's in the back of the unit, and one sergeant who roams back and forth between the two sides. So as a counselor, I handled parole paperwork, transfer paperwork, treatment plans, just to keep it simple, and anything else that might come up.
And in case people are wondering, is it dangerous? I can attest the fact that you were assaulted.
I was 3 years after I was hired, right in front of the officer's desk. The inmate had just been released from restricted housing for disciplinary purposes. He had been transferred to our institution from another institution where he had disciplinary issues. And he asked a question about property and did not like the answer I gave him, which was he had already sent a request slip, wait for them to respond. He thought I should hop on the phone and take care of that immediately. And I agreed. And he made his displeasure known by breaking my nose and the bridge of my nose was broken in 2 places and the septum was completely crushed.
And you had no way of anticipating, and that's part of the challenge of working within a prison system. The inmates sort of have more of an advantage because they know what they're going to do or plan. And so as staff, we don't know.
Well, not only that, but generally we are supposed to be reactive. It is a reactive system. We don't do anything until the inmate does something. Many people think that once these individuals are locked up, they are no longer a threat. Well, they're no longer a threat to general population. They're no longer a threat to outside society, but they are still a threat even inside the walls to the other people who are inside the walls.
And one of the things we're going to speak to, either if we get to it on this side of the break or this program or the follow-up program, is what is it like for staff, the amount of stress. So we'll be able to speak to that.
As that was essentially not a short overview, but an overview of a housing unit counselor. Now, I did that for 15 years. I was very burned out. So I took the opportunity to take a treatment position. The position is called a treatment specialist, where I ran groups. And that was my primary function. I ran treatment groups, therapeutic programs, and that's what I did 5 days a week.
Which groups were you running?
We ran violence prevention, and there were 2 different levels of violence prevention, a moderate and a high. I ran a batterers program based on the Duluth model, Thinking for a Change. And then we also began running a fathers group for inmates who had children, and a long-term offenders group for inmates who were doing, I cannot remember what the qualifications were for that, but they had to be doing more than short time, more than maybe 5 or 10 years. And then the last couple of years, as the department started to push towards resentencing of those who were sentenced to life as juveniles, I began working with what we called the juvenile lifer population. I ran a program for them.
So you have seen the full range of inmates as far as dynamics and personalities and sentence structures and different crimes represented. You've had those not just in terms of your case management, but then also in the groups. So you have a wealth of knowledge. As a matter of fact, I did not ask, describe for us or tell us, how long were you in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections?
24 years I worked as a counselor. I was hired as a counselor. I retired as a counselor. When I was hired, it was 20 years of service in age 50 for retirement. I was hired at 30 years old. So I would have been 22, 23 years old when I was hired with county probation. And I ended up doing 24 years. When our sergeant was killed by an inmate, that was when I pretty much decided I was going to get out. I did a year after that and hung it up.
So between us, we have 35 years of collective experience on this podcast right now. So I would say that's probably pretty good. It's a pretty good perspective as far as field research and behind the scenes. So, as a matter of fact, let me also, Ken, have you speak to, as I work with folks and interact with folks, at times, especially those that are antagonistic, I sort of have a hunch as to why, which tend to be men that are either trying to paint things a different color or give it a different spin. They will tend to say, I either didn't work in prison or didn't work in a certain, much of a capacity. What's interesting about you, Ken, and you and I is we not only worked in the same institution, my last institution, but we also were carpool buddies, so to speak. So when you ride in a vehicle with someone, you get to know them. So you have that vantage point of me as well.
Many an interesting conversation. Many where we both agreed and disagreed on different points.
There we go. And that's what's going to be valuable about as now we get into some of the content, because this is going to be off the cuff. And you're here not to agree with me or disagree. You are here to give your perspective. One of the things, let me throw this. So I'm going to throw a couple of softballs to you, and you do whatever you want with them. Speaking to who I am, because I have become a little controversial out there. If someone were to say, well, that John Euler guy, he's either homophobic or transphobic behind the scenes, how would you respond to that?
I haven't seen you to be phobic in any manner. You are a person with very strongly held beliefs. A little crazy, but nobody gets out of the Department of Corrections with their sanity completely intact. Nobody works for as long as you have with both sex offenders and victims without having their sanity somewhat tested. So, yeah, I would simply say you have some very strongly held beliefs, and you may be a little crazy, but not in a bad way. I have always seen you use your insanity, that little bit of craziness you have, for good purposes.
Well, I appreciate that. Okay, that's good. That's good feedback. Okay, now we'll get into some of the content that's very germane to this, because again, right now we have nationwide men that are being placed in women's prisons. So that is a huge concern. Let me give a little bit of information or stats. This comes from online. Ken, you and I are going to kind of focus specifically on the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections because we know that best. But given the fact that Jeffrey Beard became the Secretary of Corrections in California after he spent many years overseeing the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, I'm going to assume there's probably some similarity between Pennsylvania and California. I am making that assumption. But let me start with giving some context or background. As far as the prison population within Pennsylvania, so that people understand when we're talking about the possibility and now the actuality of men being transferred, regardless of how they want to, quote unquote, identify themselves. Okay, an XY chromosome individual is a male. So, and most of them have a dangling participle. So they're being, they're being transferred into women's prisons. So to set the context for how serious this is, in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, the ratio of male to female prisons is, I think there's 23 prisons currently. I had that stat and it went.
Pennsylvania has 23 prisons and the Quahana boot camp, which is co-ed.
Okay, and there we go. And so of the 23, so we have that boot camp. That's sort of an alternative. If people do the boot camp, then they don't, and those are for lesser offenses. They don't have to go to prison per se. And that's military. That's kind of a military, it's a boot camp.
I had a tour of it once. Would have been interesting to work there, as I was Navy Reserve, did my time, but the boot camp, they only take volunteers, and they only take certain offenses. So they start with, if you want to call it, the best of the best among the inmates. So that helps their success rate. However, I am going to say that having been in the military, even straight reserves, the discipline that they would get from a boot camp style program, if the inmates embrace that, there is a really good chance that they might not ever come through the system again. So I am an advocate of the boot camp.
There you go. And my guess is a lot of states have a similar, it's kind of diversion. I mean, they're being sent to prison, but they're given the option then of, and they have to apply for it. And it literally has the feel of basic training for the military. And so You have to qualify for that if you're an inmate, and then you go through that, and if you complete it successfully. So it's like you're going through boot camp. A lot of the officers have military background, so they're able to apply those same skills. So, okay, but as far as we think of regular prisons, so we've got the 23, and of the 23, only 2 are for women in the state of Pennsylvania.
One is supposed to be a minimum security, and the other is supposed to be a medium-high security. Although that's in theory.
So if you were to drive by these prisons, you wouldn't know whether it's male or female. As a matter of fact, you can go online. The stats I'm going to give now are found on the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections' own website. Okay, so the 2 institutions among the 23. So first of all, I want the listeners or the viewers to get a sense of how many men versus how many women go to prison, because it's going to make a difference as we talk about men being sent to female institutions. So of the 23 prisons in Pennsylvania, we have 2 that are designated for female. That's SEI Muncie and SEI Cambridge Springs. The current population as of last month, so June 2022, the total population combined, men and women, were 37,500, I'm rounding. Okay, less than 5%. I want people to kind of let that sink in. Less than 5% of the inmates in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections are female. There's about 1,850. The female population, and I found this interesting, it increased by 25% over the past year, June 2021 to June 2022, 480 new female inmates, which is not only shocking, but that raises a lot of very interesting things. You wonder what in maybe the lockdown situation created some of that. So that would be, sociologically, that's very interesting to have a 25% increase. Now, of the difference between male and females in terms of mental health cases. So on the mental health roster, and again, anybody can go on to the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections website and look at these. There's a lot of different tabs. You look at some of the reports. For male inmates, and again, we're talking less than 5% of the total inmate population in the state of Pennsylvania, less than 5% are female. Over 95% of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, as far as inmate population, are men. Of those 2 populations, the male mental health roster shows that about 36% of the men are on the mental health roster. 7% are seriously mentally ill. In my capacity, of course, I would deal with those men as a psych staff. So 36% are on the mental health roster as far as the men. For the women, it's almost doubled. So female mental health roster, 66%. This is of December 2021. And 12% are seriously mentally ill for the women. So what I want the listeners or viewers to understand is we have less than 5% of the overall population are females in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. They have twice as many mental health issues, or those that are on the mental health roster. So a very small population has twice the mental health issues and twice the seriously mentally ill. And those are some of the more profound mental health diagnoses. So the difference between female population and male population couldn't be any more stark in terms of the range of offenses and then the nature of their stability, who we're talking about. So also the vulnerability, because if somebody's on the mental health roster, they are considered more vulnerable. So for women, they are twice as likely to be on the mental health roster as men. Now, I wanted to bring up another important point. Of the prisons in the U.S., nearly half, So we have 24 states with only one female prison. Now I'm heading somewhere with this in terms of the danger for women. Pennsylvania has 2. So if we have a man who's decided to transition in Pennsylvania, he's going to go to one of those 2 if he's permitted to go in there. Of 24 states, all the men that are going to transition are going to go to one institution that houses all the state's female inmates. Let me read the states with just one. Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan. Think about Detroit. And the question is this: how many of these states are high sex trafficking? And where I'm heading is you potentially could have a pimp that decides to remind his supposed property, that's what they call the women, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Okay, we have Minnesota, Mississippi, Montana, Nebraska, New Hampshire, New Jersey, North Dakota, Oregon, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming only have one female prison, so half the prisons, essentially. Some of the states that have quite a few, Idaho has 3, Nevada has 3, North Carolina 4, Wisconsin 4, Florida, Georgia, New York have 6, and Texas has 9. So we have in half the U.S., we have all the females that end up going to prison who have twice the rate of mental illness as men. We have them all confined in one location, so they are a captive audience. So now the question is this, Ken.
Yeah.
From your perspective, and we dealt with trans inmates. I had one in my long-term program at the first institution, and then there was starting to become more of, I don't want to say an influx, because that, a couple of them were an influx, but around about 2014 to 2015 is when I noticed on psych staff, because all of them ended up on the special needs unit, and they ended up, or I shouldn't say all of them, but a number of them ended up in the special needs unit, and therefore psychology kind of followed them. And a number of them were placed on my roster, my caseload, because, and I found this interesting, because I was one of the psych staff that would treat them with respect. And maybe also because they didn't want to, I don't know. That's interesting to think why they ended up on my caseload.
But John, I thought you were phobic.
Yeah, Okay, so Ken, talk to us, because especially in light of, and maybe I'll read this, and we'll go a little bit longer on this segment of the program. What's interesting is just recently, within the past couple of weeks, I'm going to read an article from Elizabeth Johnson. It doesn't matter where the article is located, because some people find her maybe too conservative, but she writes, trans prisoner transferred to youth facility after impregnating inmates at women's prison.
Imagine that.
Say it again.
Imagine that.
Can you imagine? So a transgender inmate has been transferred to a youth facility. I have huge concerns about that, because the perpetrator is 27 years old. Okay, so a transgender inmate has been transferred to a youth facility after impregnating 2 fellow inmates, meaning 2 women. Okay, this is a trans inmate who identified with women, not just one pregnancy, but 2. Now they send this perp to a youthful offenders program. Has been serving 30-year sentence, here it is, for manslaughter since the age of 16. Now, people would say, well, he was no threat because he didn't have a sex offense. And it goes on to talk about what the perpetrator did. Ken, you worked in the prison system for a long time. I didn't work as long. My stint was a little over 11 years. What are your thoughts? You saw them come in. Let's now talk kind of off the cuff. Everything from, do you think that there's a need to transfer them to a women's prison, because do you think they are at risk? Because what the general public is being told is these very sensitive, frail men in drag are easy target for exploitation. They're sent, they're just going to get harmed in the male prison, and therefore we have to make sure that they're protected. So under the guise of that, we're going to send them to do their time. A man, we're going to send him over to a female prison, and we just found out that one of them had a wonderful time with, and the question is, how many other women did he rape? Okay. And that's against the rules in the Department of Corrections. You can't, whether same gender or not, you can't do that.
No. How blunt may I be, John?
I want you to be yourself.
Are you sure?
You be yourself, absolutely.
Okay. I had a conversation just within the last few weeks with another former coworker who was he was a sergeant when I worked with him. I think he transferred to another institution and retired from yet another institution, I believe possibly as a lieutenant. But he worked at the county jail, and he was familiar with some of the people that I knew when I worked for county probation. One of them being a very large, by large I mean tall and big boned, not fat by any stretch of the imagination, but a very stocky person who was trans. And this would have been back in, let me see, I started with the county in 88. I left in 95. So this would have been probably in the early 90s, 90, 91, 92, somewhere around in there. This individual was on my caseload for assaults. He would generally wore a dress. I don't think I ever saw him wearing pants. Had grown his own hair out. Pretty good with doing the makeup. But he would go out to not what I would consider to be the nicer bars in the area, pick somebody up who did not know the situation or get picked up, manage to get himself picked up, go out parking, and you told me to be myself, John. The guy would eventually reach up under the dress and find himself holding a tree trunk. At which point, 9 times out of 10, a fight would ensue. And although this was a person with breasts who was, I believe at the time, on female hormones, was still biologically a male. And the last conversation I remember having with this parolee, I said, you've got to stop doing this. Eventually, you're going to kill somebody. And you're going to spend a very long period of time in prison. Because the pre-sentence at that point was for an assault where he hit the guy over the head with a 40-ounce beer bottle.
Now, Ken, when you say you told him he has to stop doing this, meaning what?
What I was referencing and what I specified to him in the conversation was, you got to stop going out and picking up people or getting picked up by people who do not know the circumstances. If he's going home with somebody or going parking with somebody who knows what's happening, that is between 2 consenting adults. I have no issue with that. But putting himself in a situation that he knows is likely to end up in a physical confrontation is dangerous for both parties.
And it's deceptive. As a matter of fact, Ken, my contention is this. We we hear a lot, or I see a lot of posts or different conversations about, and we've all seen news articles, how trans are being targeted for hate crimes. And my contention is this. Number one, that's disingenuous. The reality is this. I don't know anybody that goes out looking for a trans to harm them. What I found in the DOC on my caseload and in my groups, and you just spoke to the issue, is this. It comes down to lifestyle. Because I had a number of guys in my groups in violence prevention that beat the tar out of. So the guy they were found out that they were with, under the guise that the inmates picking up a female at a bar. The apparent female was not large. Now you're referencing a guy that was very large that would beat the tar out of the unsuspecting potential participant. But my contention is this. Yeah. It is not people that do random drive-by domestic terrorist type of activities toward trans. It is the lifestyle and the associations and the activities that these gentlemen are in, including they're picking guys up, and the guys don't know it. It's exactly what you referenced. So that's a lack of full disclosure, pardon the pun, but it's true, so that a guy doesn't know what he's getting himself into. Now he's humiliated or surprised, and he's going to respond accordingly. Or they're into prostitution, and or you look at the lifestyles and it's filled with drugs and alcohol, and what goes together with that? Unsavory characters.
So I talked a lot to inmates about lifestyle. With any type of lifestyle choice that was going to put them at risk or put them in a position to come into contact with law enforcement or with those who might be looking to harm them. Drug dealers, gangbangers, any of it. It comes down to a lifestyle choice, and that fits with this subject as well.
Ken, we're up against the clock. We're going to continue already. We're going to continue after or on the next segment. But to bring things to a close for this segment, and we'll pick up where we leave off right now, because we're just now really starting to get into the nature of, as it were, the trans inmates and the ones that are in the institution. In your estimation, so we'll kind of we'll let you answer this briefly, and then we'll elaborate more on the next program. In your estimation, is there any good reason why a male inmate should be transferred to a female institution?
Good for the male inmate or good in general?
For the safety of the females.
Because if you're talking good for the male inmate, if he's going to be locked up for a period of time and he wants to have sex, I'm sure he would prefer to have a large population of women to have sex with rather than a large population of men. But generally speaking, I can't come up with any good reason. I can come up with a number of reasons it shouldn't happen, but I can't come up with a single reason it should.
We are going to pick up elaborating on that statement of yours on the next edition of the Predator Watch podcast.
You've been listening to Predator Watch, dedicated to shining the light of truth about the nature of the most sophisticated of sexual predators most likely to target places where victims are most easily accessed. For John Euler and the entire team, thanks for listening.
Predator Watch has been sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. As a non-profit organization, Survivor Support is dependent upon the generosity of people who believe in its mission of supporting survivors. Please consider becoming a monthly supporter of this important work.